In a folder marked Franklin County 1935, held in the Western District of Virginia federal court records, there is a typed witness list, 55 names. By the end of that trial, the largest moonshine conspiracy case in American history, only 23 of those men served real time. The other 32 walked free, despite mountains of evidence stacked against them. The question that has haunted historians for nearly a century is simple. How did unschooled mountain men, most of whom had never traveled more than 40 miles from where they were born, outmaneuver a federal prosecution that spent 2 years and the equivalent of $4 million building its case? The answer is not luck. The answer is a system of survival passed down through 3 generations of Appalachian families. Refined in hollows the government could not map, protected by a code so disciplined that paid informants gave up trying to break it. Most of what they did was never written down, but pieces of it survived in court transcripts in the Foxfire interviews recorded between 1966, 1979, and in the oral histories collected by Berea College in eastern Kentucky. What follows is reconstructed from those documents. To understand what these men and women built, you have to understand the world they were born into. In 1929, the year the stock market collapsed, the average cash income for a family in Wilkes County, North Carolina was $87 a year. Not $87 a week. $87 for the entire year. Corn sold for 25 cents a bushel if a buyer could be found at all. But that same bushel of corn run through a copper still and turned into roughly 2.5 gallons of liquor would bring in between $8 and $12 in the cities of Charlotte, Roanoke, and Knoxville. The math was not a temptation, it was survival. Horace Kephart, writing in Our Southern Highlanders, published in 1913, described a mountain economy where the only crop that could be carried out of the hollows on a mule and converted to cash was distilled corn. The roads were mud, the railroads bypassed the high ridges. A man with 40 acres of steep ground had 2 choices. Watch his children go hungry, or learn the skill his grandfather brought down from the Scotch-Irish settlements of the 1780s. By 1932, in a single county in southwestern Virginia, federal investigators estimated that 99 of every 100 families were involved in the trade, either as distillers, as runners, as suppliers of sugar and copper, or as silent partners who simply refused to talk. This is the world that produced the people you are about to meet. In the spring of 1934, a woman named Maggie Bailey was 30 years old, standing 5'2", living in Clovertown, Harlan County, Kentucky. She had taken over the family business after her father could no longer run it. For the next 71 years, until her death in 2005, at the age of 101, she sold bootleg liquor out of her home. She was arrested dozens of times. She was convicted exactly twice. She never spent a full day in prison. When asked by a reporter from the Lexington Herald-Leader in 1996 how she had survived so long, she answered with one sentence. She said, "I never sold to a child, I never sold to a drunk, and I never wrote anything down." That sentence contains the first principle of how the mountain trade survived. Nothing on paper, ever. No ledgers, no customer lists, no inventory counts. Maggie Bailey memorized every transaction, so did her father, so did the men who ran routes for her. Federal investigators who searched her property a dozen times found liquor, but they never found evidence that could connect her to a network, because the network existed only in the heads of the people who ran it. The second principle was geography weaponized. The hollows of southern Appalachia are not random folds in the landscape. They are narrow, twisting valleys with one way in and one way out. A still place 3 miles up a hollow could not be approached without the operator hearing footsteps on dry leaves from a half-mile away. The Foxfire interviews record an old distiller, identified only as Aunt Airy, describing how her family kept geese near the path. Geese, she explained, hear better than dogs and cannot be quieted with a piece of meat, but geography alone was not enough. By the time agents began pushing serious operations into the mountains in the early 1930s, the Moonshiners had to invent something new. This is where the story turns. The agents came in with maps, with paid informants, and with the legal authority to seize property on suspicion alone. Between 1,922 and 1,935 federal records document at least 174 moonshiners killed during raids in the southern Appalachians. The number of agents killed in the same period was 27. These were not symbolic clashes. These were gun battles in the woods, sometimes lasting hours, with families on both sides waiting to learn who would walk back out. The mountain response was not to fight harder, it was to outthink. In Wilkes County, North Carolina, men began modifying their family cars, stripping interiors, reinforcing rear suspensions, swapping in larger engines from Cadillacs and Lincolns. The cars looked ordinary on the outside. Inside, they could carry 120 gallons of liquor at speeds of 100 miles an hour over dirt roads at night, with no headlights, driven by men who knew every curve by feel. One of those drivers was a teenager named Junior Johnson, who would later become a NASCAR Hall of Famer. He was caught exactly once, in 1956, at his father's still, never on the road. He served 11 months in federal prison in Chillicothe, Ohio. He never gave up a single name. A woman named Willie Carter Sharp ran liquor for the Franklin County operation through the early 1930s. Court testimony from the Great Moonshine Conspiracy Trial of 1935 describes her driving a stripped-down sedan through Roanoke at 75 miles an hour with 3 federal cars chasing her. She wore a diamond on her finger that flashed when she leaned out the window. She paid for the diamond with 2 runs to Richmond. She testified at the conspiracy trial, but the names she gave were already names the prosecution had. The names she protected, she took to her grave. This is where the lesson reaches across nearly a century and lands in the lap of someone who has never seen a copper still. The principle these people lived by was not about liquor. It was about refusing to be dependent on a system that had no use for them. They built parallel economies. They taught skills inside families instead of buying them from strangers. They kept their finances invisible. They trusted slowly and only people whose their grandparents had known. If you live in a city, in a suburb, in an apartment where your neighbors are nameless, that lesson still applies. The mountain code was not poverty. It was sovereignty. It was the decision that the most important asset a family owns is the knowledge it refuses to forget and the loyalty it refuses to sell. A man who can fix his own engine, grow part of his own food. Trust 3 people without contracts is harder to crush than a man with a 6-figure salary and no skills outside his cubicle. The federal government in 1935 had every advantage of money, technology, and legal force. It still could not break a network of people who simply would not betray each other. By the autumn of 1935, the prosecution in the Great Moonshine Conspiracy Trial believed they had won. They had 55 defendants. They had hundreds of witnesses. They had bank records showing $33 million in untaxed liquor moved through Franklin County alone over a 5-year period. The lead prosecutor, Frank Tavener, told the press the case would dismantle the Southern moonshine economy permanently. It did not. The convictions came down, sentences were handed out, but within 18 months, production in Franklin County had fully recovered. By 1940, it had exceeded its pre-trial peak. The reason is the climax of this story, and it is the detail that most history books leave out. In Joseph Earl Dabney's 1974 book Mountain Spirits, drawing on interviews conducted between 1968 and 1973, there's a passage describing what happened in the hollows during the months the trial was underway. The men who were not indicted did not panic. They did not hide. They did something the federal government had not anticipated. They began teaching. Older distillers walked younger boys, some as young as 11 and 12, through every step of the process. They taught not just how to run a still, but how to choose a site, how to read weather, how to recognize an informant by the questions he asked, how to maintain silence under pressure. The trial, instead of ending the tradition, accelerated its transmission to the next generation. By the time the convicted men returned from prison, there were 3 times as many distillers operating as there had been when they left. This is the document that explains the paradox. The knowledge was not in the still. It was in the mouths of grandfathers speaking to grandsons on porches. The federal government could not subpoena. You cannot raid a conversation. You cannot seize a memory. The skill survived because the people who held it understood that the only way to lose it was to fail to pass it on, and the only way to keep it was to teach it faster than the law could prosecute it. Popcorn Sutton, who died in 2009 inches, Maggie Valley, North Carolina, learned the trade from his cousin in the 1940s, who had learned it from men who came home from the federal penitentiary in 1939. Popcorn taught it to a handful of apprentices before his death. The chain has not broken in over 240 years. Maggie Bailey is buried in Harlan County, Kentucky. Her gravestone gives her name and her dates. It says nothing about the 71 years she fed her neighbors during a depression that the rest of the country tried to forget she lived through. If you believe real American history has been softened, sanitized, and buried, you understand why this channel exists. The question for you is this. Of the people in this story, Maggie Bailey, Junior Johnson, Willie Carter Sharp, Popcorn Sutton, which one would you have trusted to hide your family if the federal cars came up your road tonight? Leave your answer in the comments and tell us what state or country you are watching from. Subscribe to stand with a growing community of people who refuse to let real history disappear into the soft version they teach in schools. The next story we tell concerns a man named Amos Owens, the cherry bounce man of Rutherford County, who served 3 federal sentences and died believing he had outlived every agent who ever chased him. The records suggest he was right.